The Civil War was one of the most important wars ever fought by America over several polarizing issues. The war was fought by the then divided United States into the Northern Union and the Southern Confederate States of America. Though the war only lasted 4 years, its results still affect America 100 years later.
The secession of the Confederate States of America was caused by many different factors. For starters, the perennial problem of slavery had existed, but as the North ramped up their calls for the abolition of slavery, the South hardened on their stance. The North's industrial-based economy didn't require slaves in the way the South did. The North's need for slaves decreased as they needed more and more skilled laborers to keep up the industry. This feud led to the nation being polarized on the issue, and a country that had once fought united to be divided.
In addition, the election of Abraham Lincoln increased tensions even more. Lincoln was from the new Republican Party, formed by liberals and abolitionists a few years prior. Not only did the Republicans take the presidency, they also took control of Congress, asserting their power just a few years after being created. While Lincoln was not originally the abolitionist we know today, he represented the change to come, something the Southern slave owners could not accept.
After the secession of the Southern states, Lincoln was opposed to starting the war and continued to try and work things out and get them to rejoin the Union. Lincoln did not want to instigate the war and tried to bring the country back through diplomacy. However, the South, led by President Jefferson Davis, were unwilling to rejoin, and the talks eventually fell through.
The North had a variety of advantages over their Southern counterparts, which greatly contributed to their victory. First off, the Union had a population of nearly 22 million, while the South had a mere 9 million, of which 6 million were free people. This allowed the Union to have access to many more potential soldiers and no problem in fielding troops. The vastly different types of economy also aided the North. The North was industrialized, and as such, contained most of the factories in the United States. This meant that it was much easier to produce war materials for the Union, a factor that became very important in the latter stages of the war. The South's farm-based economy required thousands of people to work in the fields.
All talks of reconciliation ended on April 12, 1861, when the Confederate States started the American Civil War with their attack on the Union-held Fort Sumter, near Charleston, South Carolina. The Confederates bombarded the fort for 2 days straight, before the officer in charge of the fort surrendered. This became the official start of the Civil War.
This attack enraged the North, leading to thousands enlisting when Lincoln called for a volunteer army of 75,000 troops for 90 days. The short time reflected the views held by many in the North, that this would be a quick and simple war. While much of the officers in the United States Army stayed with the Union, a notable few joined the Confederacy, including Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. Though they lacked the numbers of the Union, the South was also able to recruit a multitude of reputable officers.
Though the North had much confidence at the beginning, it started to fade as the Confederacy was able to pull off a surprising amount of victories in 1861, including the First Battle of Bull Run and the Battle of Wilson's Creek. The war had seemed to go against the Union due to the several military defeats, leading to several changes in the Union Army. These battles shook the belief of the people of the Union and sent the nation into shock. This led to the belief that the war would take several years and be a hard-fought battle.
However, this was overturned with successes in early 1862 with the Battle of Fort Donelson, which granted the Union control of the Cumberland River in Tennessee, and the Battle of Pea Ridge, which ensured Union control over border state Missouri. These were followed by the successes at the Battle of Shiloh, which led to the most casualties in one day up to that point, and the Battle of Fort Jackson and St. Philip, in which the Union gained control of New Orleans. New Orleans was not only a major port city, but it was a way for the Confederates to move supplies of troops from places like Texas to the East Coast, and made it much harder for transportation.
As the Union Army gained victories in the South and West, General McClellan finally mobilized the large Army of the Potomac. His army was stationed near Washington, D.C., where he spent much of the previous time constructing the defenses that surrounded the city in case of a Confederate invasion. McClellan sailed his troops to Fort Monroe on the Virginian Peninsula in March 62, where the Peninsula Campaign commenced. McClellan pushed forward towards the Confederate capital, albeit at a slow pace, giving the Confederate forces time to dig in. The climax of the battle came during the 7 days battle, in which the smaller Confederate army was able to fend off the Union troops and send them back to the Union territory at the end of June. This defeat shocked the North.
This was soon followed by yet another Confederate victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run in northern Virginia, where the Confederates defeated the Union. This sent the Union Army back into Union borders and caused a break in the Union's momentum. Robert E. Lee followed this up with his attempted Maryland campaign, but by the end of September, the Confederacy withdrew. One of the most notable battles, the Battle of Antietam, occurred during this campaign. It was the deadliest one-day battle up to that point, and resulted in the death of almost 23,000 soldiers in the course of a day. This victory was used by Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which decreed that all slaves in the Confederacy to be freed, liberating almost 20,000 slaves immediately in the Union-held Confederate territory. In December of 1862, Ambrose Burnside, the new leader of the Army of the Potomac, led Union forces into Virginia again, only to be turned back after the Battle of Fredericksburg.
Though the Union Army was much larger, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was very successful in defending Virginia, again routing Union forces in the Battle of Chancellorsville. However, Lee lost his right-hand man, General Stonewall Jackson, to friendly fire.
West Virginia separated from Virginia and became a part of the Union in May of 1863. When Virginia had voted to secede, many senators from the Northwest had voted against secession, and this became the part of Virginia that would join the Union. They were admitted after they agreed to a clause that would gradually abolish slavery.
In June 1863, Lee began an attack on the North, being dubbed the Gettysburg Campaign. This campaign would later be recognized as the turning point of the war. The Army of Northern Virginia marched through Maryland and reached Pennsylvania, engaging in multiple battles along the way. This all culminated in the Battle of Gettysburg, where the chasing Union Army confronted the Confederates in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
Here, the Confederate and Union armies engaged in a 3-day battle at the beginning of June. This battle would become one of the most important of the entire war. Here, Lee engaged General George Meade in a 3-day battle. After defeat was imminent, Lee was forced to retreat and head back to the Confederacy, effectively ending the Gettysburg Campaign. Not only did this send his army back, but the battle and campaign also killed many of his soldiers.
The Confederacy was not as successful as the North in its ability to recruit troops, and the loss here was something Lee was never able to recover from. Lincoln also gave the famed Gettysburg Address here in November 19, 1863, a speech that became one of the most famous speeches in American history. At the same time, Ulysses S. Grant was besieging the Confederate city of Vicksburg, which was a major port on the Mississippi River. Grant had the city of Vicksburg under siege for 2 months, and finally captured it on July 4, 1863, just one day after the Union successes at Gettysburg. This victory effectively split the Confederacy in two. The Union now controlled all of the Mississippi, putting the Confederacy in an even worse position than it already was.
After his success in Vicksburg, Grant moved inwards in September. From late September to late November, Grant conducted the Chattanooga campaign, in which the Union forces successfully captured Chattanooga. From here, it was easy sailing for the Union forces to capture the heart of the Confederacy.
However, in early 1864, Grant became the leader of all Union armies and returned back to Washington, D.C. From there, he started the Overland Campaign, which pushed the Union forces into Virginia. As Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was pushed further and further back, Lee was forced to settle in Petersburg in order to protect the capital. Petersburg was the main supply base for Richmond, and the loss of it would surely have meant the loss of the war for the Confederates. This eventually led to the siege of Petersburg from June of 1864 to March 1865, where Lee's troops were pinned down in Petersburg.
In the South, William Tecumseh Sherman was able to capture Atlanta, Georgia, in September 1864. From there, Sherman launched his ruthless march to the sea. Sherman's forces followed a scorched earth policy, in which the troops destroyed and burned all property and land in between them and the ocean. Only 2 months later, Sherman successfully captured Savannah, Georgia, leaving behind a path of destruction.
Back in Virginia, Lee was able to evacuate the city of Petersburg, with the Union forces taking over soon after. Grant pursued Lee's army to Appomattox, where Lee staged his final stand. Here, on April 9, 1865, Lee's small and weak army fought its final battle against the numerically superior troops of General Grant. Here, the two sides fought, and Lee tried to retreat to Lynchburg, but the large Union army was too much. The two sides eventually settled on Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee surrendered his army to General Grant. Grant was quite generous in the terms, and allowed for the soldiers to retain their arms and prevented them from being arrested for treason. This surrender disheartened the South, leading to the rest of the Confederacy surrendering soon after.
During the war, African Americans were very important to both the North and South. In the South, they kept the economy afloat, tending to plantations every day in order to make money for their owners. In the North, they embodied why the war was fought for some people. At the start of the war, African Americans were not allowed to serve in the armed forces, and had to wait till the middle of 1862 before they could legally enlist. Among these troops was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. This regiment engaged in the Battle of Fort Wagner, the most famous battle to see segregated black forces fighting. In addition, people like Harriet Tubman were tirelessly working during this time to free slaves from the South, leading them up to the Underground Railroad to freedom in the Union.
The end of the Civil War brought about the death of nearly 700,000 soldiers, and the end of the short-lived Confederate States of America. It finally brought about an end to slavery and reunited the United States. As the nation returned to normalcy, much of the nation was very different. The infrastructure in the South was heavily damaged and destroyed, while the northern states got off relatively unharmed. Many people in the former Confederate States lived in poverty at the end of the war, due to the destructions and seizures by the Union Army. The end of the Civil War led to the Reconstruction era, a time of major change across America until the late 1870s.